All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to a special edition, I guess, of SaberSim's office hours. You might also be listening to this on the podcast feed for Behind the Sims. We're going to be putting this up there as well. My name's Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and I've got our two data scientists, Eric and Will, with me here today, who have been working really hard the past, what has it been, guys? Month, 2 months on the brand new golf sims and model?
Yeah, just about.
Cool. Yeah. So we just put this out yesterday, actually. Obviously, the fresh new year of golf starting this week, and wanted to have these guys come on and talk a little bit about the new model, how it works, what we've improved upon from the old sim, and just answer some questions for you guys. Obviously, here live, looks like we've got a few people joining us live here as well. So we'll go ahead and just get into it. We have a lot to get into here. Wanted to start right off the bat just to ask both of you guys, why are sims valuable for golf in particular? Obviously, we have the ability to generate projections for a sport and publish projections and ownership and call it a day, but taking the extra step here to generate full simulations for golf. So what's important about sims in golf? Why did we go about it this way here?
Yeah, so I'll start. I think sims are really valuable because they can sort of recreate like a possible outcome of a golf contest, and that can really help with like sort of hidden correlations or things like that. Obviously, if you have two very high-end golfers, they can't both come in first place in like an actual result. And that's something that like mean projections don't necessarily capture, or at least not as well as an individual sim that might capture that, if this guy's coming in first, that means this other person at best is coming in second, and that limits some of their upside. So I think that there's a lot of sort of like, hidden things there that mean projections will miss. And then especially with Showdown, it's like really valuable on, the different types, and especially round 4 with finishing position. I think there's a lot of interesting edge that can be captured there.
Yeah, and just kind of to add on to that, I think too, one of the unique pieces of golf is the cut. And obviously we aren't going to see that this week, but with the sim approach, we're going to see sort of those top golfers miss the cut every now and then. And they're going to score like 20 fantasy points versus getting through the cut is just like an automatic, like 60 fantasy points or whatever. So you have a very split distribution, as you can see on the screen there, that we're actually modeling, and not just looking at sort of one point number.
Yeah, no, it is interesting here. It kind of almost reminds me, and for folks listening to the podcast feeds, you got the distribution for Adam Hadwin here pulled up for last year's. This is the Canadian Open, right? Eric, is that correct? Yeah. So no cut this week. Wanted to do a sim for an event last year that did have a cut, and yeah, I mean these distributions are pretty unique. Almost kind of reminds me of an MMA like distribution, with kind of the bimodal there, missing the cut, making the cut, just something very hard to capture in an average projection that's intended to sum up the entire range of outcomes of what could happen there. So when we're talking about the sim itself, I think one thing that's kind of always interesting, like what is actually going on behind the scenes? I always use the expression under the hood. If somebody could kind of like look under SaberSim and see the golf sim in action, what's going on there as we're simulating a tournament?
Yeah, so I can kind of start with this one. So really, one of, I guess, the benefits of golf and all of the data that's involved in golf is you really can, extrapolate back, and so we can look kind of backwards. So what we started with for the sim was we wanted to generate essentially a player skill or sort of like a power ranking for a player in a tournament. And so we do that by incorporating things like odds, sort of other more like black box methods that all go into this generation of our power ranking for a player. And we can do that for, tournaments like the Canadian Open in 2022. And, we can do that for the Masters in 2021. And then what we can do is we can run a regression to try and predict the round scores. So this sim, as it currently sits, is a round by round sim. And so we're sort of taking that power ranking and we're saying, okay, historically players around this skill level, what does rounds look like? So, how often do they shoot a -2 round? How often do they shoot a -1 round? And we're doing that sort of for all of the players in the field.
So how does that change basically the way that we think about a given golfer, that golfer skill level, as a season goes on, basically? Like if we have a golfer that maybe gets off to a very hot start, maybe better than we would have expected based on our skill rating, how are we going to adjust throughout the year for that new performance?
Yeah, so that's like my baby is is basically handling how much to trust new data, how much new data do we need to see to like fully change it, because obviously as any new data comes in, it's immediately getting incorporated in the model. But depending on how much previous data we have, other sort of mathematical concepts to discount the new data, it changes how much we can fluctuate it. And so I think that we will adapt, but we'll probably be slower. I think a lot of, at least golf news that I've seen, is very quick to like jump on. Like as soon as, if you are having 3 good tournaments, you're now the favorite in the next one, and that doesn't really line up with like some of the data. So it's much more like you have peaks, you have valleys, but your skill can change, but probably not as quickly as other sources think.
And I mean, do you guys think that just kind of in general that short-term performance is overvalued by the field for that reason?
Yeah, at least I do, for sure. I don't know about you, Eric.
Yeah, I think you can see it in some of the Showdown ownerships. I know that when Showdown like first came out, it was crazy. Like Showdown for golf, when it first came out, it was crazy how inflated the ownerships were in round 2 of like the round 1 leader, where like obviously you want to incorporate that round, but it isn't. It shouldn't be that big of an effect. So definitely agree that the recent form stuff is often sort of overvalued.
And as we're kind of tracking performance throughout a season and incorporating, recent form, longer form, how are we accounting for like the different maybe reasons why a golfer might have had success? Like, are we going to differentiate between, maybe a golfer who like just putted extremely well in a given tournament, which is kind of a higher variance thing? Or like, is that different than a golfer that's like, added distance to his average drive or something like that, which would theoretically maybe be a little bit more reliable for predicting future outcomes? Is there a difference there basically in like the way that we're giving credit to certain factors for why a golfer may have had a good event or a bad event?
Yeah, so I may be getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but one thing that we are working on and like near-term improvement is switching to a hole-by-hole simulator from round by round. And within that, within the hole-by-hole simulator, the work that I'm doing, we definitely isolate the different types of performances, just like the standard types of shots gained data. There's putting, maybe more variant than driving, and things like that. So we definitely make important distinctions there in how much to address individual data points in those categories. At a round by round level, I don't think that we're doing that. Unless, Eric, do you?
Yeah, no, we're not sort of at that granular level with the round by round stuff. We like sort of take it into account in our generation of that player skill, but it isn't something that's explicitly mentioned as like, oh, this person has gained 5 strokes putting last round, so like maybe that round isn't sort of all it's cracked up to.
Gotcha. And one other question I had is, when we've done this stream in the past, we've done this for Formula One and NASCAR and MMA and all of these different sports we've added new sims for recently. What's kind of unique about golf, at least like for SaberSim, is that this is a new version of the model. But I mean, we had an existing model in place before. We had existing sims in place. I don't know like how detailed you guys know how the old model worked, but I'm curious, just like in a general sense, what has like improved here, or like what is like really different about the 2023 now version of the SaberSim golf sims than what we were using for last season?
Yeah, so I think really one of the pieces that we kind of especially wanted to start with was just simplifying to get to like a good result. The previous model was a hole by hole model.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with that type of model is if there's any assumptions or in any probability, it just gets rolled and rolled and rolled because you're, choosing probabilities 18 times in a round. And so that can cause sort of cascading effects where one wrong assumption or, a weird data point or something is just going to kind of turn the model and like just turn it loose and into whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really have started, we want to start with like a good foundation of a model that's well calibrated to like real life results, essentially.
So you had mentioned that we're doing round by round sims right now, but we want to add hole by hole here. Are there concerns about like that same issue you've just described presenting in the new version now here, or what are we kind of thinking about to counteract that like compounding bad assumptions issue when we move this to a hole by hole sim?
Yes, I mean, there is that risk in it. It's just sort of obviously you work to reduce that risk, but
Mm-hmm.
because we are doing 18 times as many samples, the compounding is just going to occur. And so that's, part of the reason that we've put a lot more time like on the hole by hole side and it's taken a bit longer is really what we're trying to do is sort of like ground it a bit more. And so it's not just it's not just based on historical holes or something like that the golfer has, but it incorporates more things like the player's performance on that type of par or the course performance on that type of par. Like how do par threes play at Augusta versus par fours versus par fives? And so I think that, there's obviously more things that we're incorporating there, but I think it does a good job of keeping it near where it needs to be, and that hopefully will do a good job. And I'm really excited with some of the progress that we've seen on it.
Yeah. So kind of on that note, how are we taking into account, or I guess this is going to be kind of a broad question, but we'll start here. How are we taking into account like certain skill fit things like you've kind of described there, or maybe after we go to the hole by hole, how will we be taking that into account? I know that's something that people look into a lot. A certain course might be well suited to people that drive the ball a far distance, or maybe putters or ball strikers or whatever. How are we taking into account? Is that affected in the way that we're like looking at the golfer skill for a given event? Like as maybe a golfer that does drive the ball longer, treated as a more skilled golfer for a course where driving is important. Is that something that we're looking into, or how is that kind of captured?
Yeah, so I think that the biggest way that we capture this is splitting it by par type. So we have a different prediction model for a par 3 than a par 4 than a par 5. And so that allows them to have separate weights for it. So, a par 5 is probably going to weigh higher off the tee, like how well you're driving the ball.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like a par 3 is you're around the green and putting. And so we do break it out based on those types, and that will sort of lead itself into, I feel like, course fit, if you will, a bit. If a course has more par 4s, par 5s, and, is a driver heavy course,
Mm-hmm.
then we're going to favor better drivers than we are other players. So it does sort of get incorporated that way, but I think the largest point is through splitting it up by par type.
I think too, like you kind of hit it on the head with the player skill. And so through whether it be like Vegas odds or, something like that, we're definitely attempting to capture a piece of that. The only real difficult part is like, we don't know how much of this is like course history, and how much of this is recent form, or like how much of this is skill fit. But we do think that like that is getting essentially baked into our skill prediction for the player.
Is course history, I guess, is course history something that is kind of explicitly taken into account? I know that's something people always dig into, especially for stuff like the Masters where it's played every single year at the same place. Is that something that is like explicitly captured in the model, how golfers have performed at different courses in the past?
Yeah, so not explicitly. What we're hoping with that is that the market is sort of accounting for that in the right amount. And then so if we're using the market as an input, then that's helping us to sort of account for that. So definitely if you look at stuff like the Masters, it's like Jordan Spieth is going to be a significantly have a higher chance to win in in the Vegas odds at Augusta versus if it was the exact same field somewhere else. So it's not explicitly taken into account, but definitely it is getting baked into sort of our thinking.
Yeah, and I think that Vegas is probably the best way to go about capturing that, just because there's sort of a blend between course fit and course history.
Right.
Course history, realistically, you don't have that great of a sample size for a lot of golfers. And so if you just tell me what this guy has shot the last 3 years at Augusta, that's hard to really draw a lot of meaning from. But if that is because it is well suited to how well he drives the ball or other things like that, that's something that bettors and the market in Vegas is going to capture a lot better than just the raw data will, because people are, actually watching the golfers and making informed decisions about like how well a course suits them or not.
And on the kind of a more strategic level, do you think that the field overvalues these things? Do you think this is like an opportunity to exploit this here, or do you think it might even be maybe a limitation? I don't know. Do you think additional research can add value to the odds themselves? I guess what I'm asking is, looking at things like course history of a specific golfer or skill fit, does that seem like something more like let other people make mistakes, or something that you think there's valuable research to be done to maybe even add value to the projections?
I think I'm probably on the side of thinking that people overvalue it. And that would mean that the market overvalues it at least a little bit. But it's also it's tricky. Golf is obviously a pretty liquid market, so it's probably pretty efficient.
Yeah.
I think more on the ownership side, that's almost certainly where people are going to go overboard. Like if you assume Vegas odds are efficient and then people are overplaying recent winners at that tournament, I feel like that is something where you can get an edge on it, where it's not necessarily on the projection or the sim side itself, but is on the DFS end of it.
Another piece, without getting too far into the weeds on efficient market hypothesis and stuff like that, but if you want to look at the head-to-head market or something like that, where potentially we aren't looking at that specific matchup. So say for this week it's Jordan Spieth against Schauffele, and you see something there where that is a two-way market, and the sort of theory behind that is a two-way market will reach efficiency significantly faster and will actually reach it versus a one-way market. I think that you could add some value there in just that's an outright, this player versus this player. You can bet both sides, so it's not going to be inflated. And so, yeah, I think that would be sort of another aspect if you wanted to try not to beat Vegas, I guess, and instead just use other pieces of it to try and help the projections along.
And just so I'm understanding correctly, the idea there would basically be looking and seeing if the head-to-head market for two golfers has a discrepancy against what's implied by the outright market for those guys. Okay.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
and so I think like the best example of it was when Tiger was coming back, like I don't know when that was, 2 or 3 years ago maybe. His outrights would be like very short. He would be in like the top 10 in terms of outright odds. But because that was a one-way market, you couldn't like bet against him in the outright market. Versus when you got into sort of his matchups, he wouldn't be matched up against the top 10 guys. He would be matched up against like maybe the 20th like guy in the field.
Gotcha.
And so I think that occasionally those are just like a little bit more efficient and better reflect, I guess, like the true skill level of a golfer.
Gotcha.
Like the true opinion of the market of a golfer.
Right. That makes sense. How is weather taken into account? I know that's especially the inevitable week here we get early in the season where weather is a big deal. I don't think it's going to be a huge issue this week, but how are we factoring in weather into the Sims?
Eric,
Yeah, I can take it. Yeah, for sure. We're so right now we're not taking into account weather. Obviously, we know that the wave splits like do make a difference. And I definitely would encourage people to make adjustments to projections. I know some people like to do groups based on the wave splits, but for right now, we aren't taking into account weather. It was partially just like a data thing, and also we want to be intentional about how we're doing it and just ensure that our final result we can be confident in, and we can like put our trust behind it.
And just to add to that, we do sort of like at a like scoring environment level, we are factoring in like weather there. Obviously, like if you know, it's intraday that we're not going to be adjusting golfers. But as far as like the global scoring environment and how weather impacts that, I think that we do probably do a pretty good job there.
So when you say intraday, basically meaning we're not mid-tournament, we're not adjusting for the weather forecast as it's changing, but we have a general sense of like what scoring average to par might be for the tournament as a whole.
Correct.
Based on weather.
Right.
And I imagine some of this is kind of factored into the odds as well, which is an input here as well.
Exactly.
If the weather's like terrible, and it's going to increase the variance of the tournament, it might kind of reduce the win expectations of the favorites. I mean, maybe I should ask you guys, like, what is your sense of like what weather does to a tournament? Or Eric, you mentioned adjusting projections or maybe setting groups. Like, let's assume, for example, that we had a tournament where it was going to be very windy. Like, what is the expectation of what that does to the DFS game for that week?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit tricky. Of course, like I know there's times where people think that the wave split is going to go one way and it goes completely the opposite. I would say, like, in general, if you feel like you need to make a change based on wave split, what I would personally do is like it's probably 2 points in either way. Like it obviously is an impact, and like there's obviously an advantage if you're just playing in an easier time. But I would just caution about going overboard on like, oh, it's only going to be the Thursday AM guys who make the cut. Like that's
right.
probably not quite going to happen. But yeah, I think if there's like a stroke difference, I think around 2 points in either direction kind of lines up with like the DK scoring and everything. But a lot of that too is just personal preference and how you think that the wind is going to sort of impact the scoring environment across the various waves.
Yeah, and one thing that I've always kind of done in the past is basically only really tried to play weather angles a day out. I think it gets very hard, even setting your lineups Wednesday night when the perceived weather day is Friday, just adds so much variance and so much noise to how that could actually change. I mean, you mentioned it. Sometimes people are just certain that it's going to be the Friday PM that is a mess, and then the weather gets shifted just a little bit and it comes that night after the round's already been played, or it comes like much earlier in the morning and it flips everything on its head. I think there's, at least, you know, in my experience of playing golf DFS for the past couple of years, like it seems that there's somewhat reliability on the weather forecast for the Thursday round Wednesday night, but above and beyond that, it gets pretty hard to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to touch on one other thing that Will kind of went over with regards to like the scoring environment. I think it was in this tournament, like, well, last year, this tournament, the winner was like minus 34 or something.
Yeah.
And then 2 years ago, I think the winner was like minus 15, and it was because of the wind. Mm-hmm. So we're kind of taking our best guess at the scoring environment like before the tournament. But if we see something in round one where, you know, maybe the course underwent something and like that we didn't catch earlier, and it's actually playing much harder or much easier, we'll be able to alter the scoring environment, like for the showdowns and everything, while the tournament's in progress. So, you know, I think that that's another way that we sort of can get to the right scoring environment for the tournament and for sort of each round in the tournament.
And how does the scoring environment of a tournament change the way that golfers are projected? If, you know, what would be the difference of this course playing where the winner is expected to be minus 34 versus this course playing where the winner is expected to be minus 15?
So, you know, I'm honestly not 100% sure on the answer to that. My intuition is that the easier a course is, it's probably better to have like, or it's just going to be like a lower variance event. Mm-hmm. And so the guys at the top are just going to be a little bit better. But yeah, honestly, I'm not 100% sure on that. I don't know, Will, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I'm also not entirely sure. I think it's funny. My intuition was the other way around. The easier courses, the more likely the bottom guys would be able to hit the same shots or do better, and the harder courses are where the elite players are going to separate themselves. But I don't feel strongly. I've not thought about this a lot, so it's just...
Yeah, it's interesting. I think my like intuition is like would have been kind of in line with Eric here. But I'm not entirely sure either. I mean, I think what like comes to mind is like on some of the courses throughout the year that are like notoriously hard or like famously difficult, where scoring average like to par might be well over par. Anecdotally, those feel like events where I've spread out my exposures and wanted to get kind of diverse, but maybe that's just like that might not say anything about like the actual facts of the matter of how the scoring ends up. So yeah, that's an interesting one. But one thing that always comes up, especially when we put out these new models, is our ownership projections. How are we going about calculating the ownership? What's different now with ownership this year compared to what we were doing before?
Yeah, so our ownership is like an algorithmic based ownership. Really what we're trying to do when we build our ownership is to actually make lineups that are going to be played like in your contests. And so we're like, you know, we're optimizing essentially to try and get to the ownership projections, which just then can incorporate like, oh, if there's a really good value, like, you know, 6,500 guy that's going to be played a lot, well, then obviously the rest of the lineup has more salary, and so then it can start to inflate. Like it really contains the ownership projections to like how it actually is in real life. So in general, it's just kind of an algorithmic look based on different sources and whatever else, you know, we're kind of seeing. Another thing actually that we're or that we have added somewhat recently is just the ability to make just like an override in terms of if there's something that we've seen that we feel like the market isn't taking into account. And so actually, if you scroll down sharply, we've made an adjustment on his just to kind of reflect the fact that he pulled out from the Pro-Am today, is supposedly dealing with a back injury, might be a withdrawal risk from the tournament. So those are kind of the things that we want to manually go in and just kind of adjust, because we know that like people are looking at Schauffele's projection, but they're also considering this other thing.
Right.
And our algorithmic approach can't see that he has potentially a back injury. So, yeah.
And so some of the other like things we've been talking about here that I think people look into a lot for golf, like recent form was one that we had talked about, but also, spectacular course history or like some of these other things. Are we also looking into the way that that's going to affect ownership and making adjustments there? Or is that when I like hosted office hours in the past and people would ask questions about golf, one of the things that I always recommend looking into is like seeing if there's a particular narrative driving ownership for that particular week and then making an adjustment, because last year that was not something we were looking at all. Is that something that we're kind of factoring in this year, or like, is that another thing that we might be manually adjusting for?
No, so I think that's more of like a manual adjustment.
Okay.
In general, like what we're inputting to our ownership builder essentially are basically point projections, and so that that's really the basis of it, not like the general feel of like the DFS golf community, or I think you could add value in like if you listen to podcasts, it's sort of like NFL where guys can just get like steamed by getting talked about on 4 different PGA DFS podcasts, and you might be able to pick up on that, whereas obviously our model can't listen to the podcast. So
right, not yet.
Yeah, that's right. Will's working on that.
Yeah.
Don't tempt me.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about Showdown as well. First things first, how are the Showdown sims different than the main slate sims, especially as the tournament is progressing? Like one very common question, I think we got it from like 3 or 4 different users here before the show, was is the current tournament in input to the new sims? Is what's happened in round 1 an input to the round 2 sims for Showdown?
Yeah, so that's something that explicitly like isn't in the sim. So if someone does extremely well round 1, it's basically not going to alter sort of our power ranking or our player skill for them for round 2. I do know that like the data golf guys put out a post on that talking about like the last round is worth like 2% or something. So it is a small, but obviously like there is some signal there. I will say that piece is likely overvalued within the Showdown context. And so not having it, obviously we want to include that in the future, and like we're aware.
I think we
necessarily
yeah,
the
I think we
worst
lost-
thing.
Oh, there he is.
I think we lost you a little bit there,
We're good?
Eric.
Okay.
So you were saying that this is something we do want to add in the future, but
yeah, essentially we want to add in the future, but it isn't necessarily the worst thing just to not have it, given that the field is probably overweighting it in showdowns.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see that in ownership, like actual ownerships, when the cards flip over for round 2, that like the guy that shot -7 and is leading the leaderboard will be extremely high owned compared to like if you think about it, if those rounds had just happened out of order, like the ownerships would have been very different there. So one question though, obviously round 4 showdowns in particular, where final leaderboard position is such a big part of a player's score, is that captured? I mean, we are kind of accounting for the fact that, you know, the golfer heading into round 4 actually is very much advantaged, or at least theoretically somewhat advantaged, than, you know, the guy that's in 20th place, just based on that finishing score.
Yeah,
is that
absolutely.
taken into account? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we have the at the start of the round 4 sim, if you will. It's taking in their current score and their current position on the leaderboard.
Gotcha. Cool. And I mean, your guys' thoughts just in general, like about Showdown. Will, I mean, I know you had a lot of success, like with like even just some single entries last year in Golf Showdown. We were talking a little bit before the stream about just the edge in Showdown in general. I mean, is this a game type that you'd recommend people checking out, especially if they haven't like played much golf DFS or have been focusing mainly on main slates in the past?
Yeah, especially with sims. I mean, that this is like a very significant, at least in generating like sort of the optimal lineups and everything like that. I think that you can generate a lot of edge using simulations, and round 4 specifically, because golf is sort of like an uncorrelated sport outside of, you know, the tee times weather. And then in round 4, there's like some real correlations. And I think that sudden switch up is definitely something that the field isn't doing optimally. And so, you know, using simulations to figure out what those are, how lineups should look, given those, is a pretty significant edge for sure.
What does that correlation look like? I'm curious to hear more on that. You said like there's correlation introduced in round 4.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it ties back to my earlier point of like 2 golfers can't both finish first. And so golfers that are, you know, starting further back, like it, you know, if you have the person in first and then the person in 20th, if the person in 20th is finishing first, they're negatively correlated with the person who started in first because they've now lost position. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It almost reminds me a little bit. We had talked about this a bit when we were doing the NASCAR model stream, where, you know, like the driver starting in first and the driver starting in second, like probably have some negative correlation, because the upside outcome for either of them is basically dominating the track and like leading and having fastest lap every single time, that kind of thing. Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. And just, I guess to add to that, like, just kind of to illustrate the value of Sims itself, is like there could be a tournament where you have 2 guys like way out in front before round 4. And they're obviously like negatively correlated from like they both can't win. But given like, you know, you're still accounting for those second place points and those first place points on top of what they're doing. And so the sim really allows us to like capture every single data point that like that's actually going to happen in the sim. And so even though they're negatively correlated, like there definitely could be a ton of situations where I think it's like 8 points per second that like more than makes up for the negative correlation. So
for sure.
Interesting. But average projections are not going to capture that at all. I mean, they're going to basically split the difference between all of the possible finishing things and lose out on that. Okay, interesting. I personally haven't played too much Showdown in particular. I played the main slates for most of the tournaments the past couple of years, but I think with the new Sims in particular, I think I will at least be checking it out here a little bit. One question that I had as well is, have we done any analysis on like this model as like a comparison from what we had before to like prove that this is kind of better, or just demonstrate how accurate we are here? I'm curious if we've done any, like, I guess, back testing basically on the new model.
Yeah, so we haven't done anything sort of in comparison to the old model. Just we knew that we were replacing it, and we knew that there were shortcomings with the old model. We have done essentially calibration testing on the new model, which basically just means like when we're predicting something at, you know, an 85th percentile, we want to make sure that that's actually happening, or that's actually happening like that percent of the time. And we found that the calibration is like very good. So I think like, there's not like a specific metric to point to, like, to look at R squareds for golf doesn't really matter, just with the cut and everything. But really what we care about is that our distribution is following what's actually happening in real life very closely.
So is that kind of like at the player percentiles level, what you were referring to, like making sure that the player's actually only scoring their 95th percentile 5% of the time or whatever? Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's correct.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay, I did want to ask a little bit as well here about like kind of some more practical thoughts here. So, I mean, the first one, especially for somebody maybe new to golf, when is it safe to start building, or how much are new sims going to run throughout the week? How much is like news affecting our sims, that kind of thing, especially for somebody like brand new to golf and not really familiar with it?
I think, at least like my opinion on it is, it's going to be fairly static outside of perhaps the impact of weather on scoring environment, like you had touched upon earlier. So like, honestly, when they go up, I can't imagine that they're going to change too significantly without it being something weird. So like my at least my first take on it is, when they go up, they're pretty close to what they will be at closing.
Yeah, I think like if you want to wait for the best information, I would wait till Wednesday. Just all of like in that way, all of the information is captured, where like odds have moved. There's sort of been all of that, I guess, like efficiency taking place. And so like, I don't know. I think Wednesday is like safe. Definitely it's not like NBA where 6 hours ago you could be completely outdated. Like,
right.
It's not going to be like that. And so if you happen to build on a Monday or a Tuesday, like, it's not like you're completely, it's not like you're going to be playing a guy who's now has a 5-minute projection. But I think, if you want to take in all of that available information, I think Wednesday's pretty safe.
And the main thing to watch out there for would be withdrawals primarily. That would, shake up everything. That would shake up the odds probably quite a bit, especially if it was a favorite, something to look out for. So for this week, definitely keep an eye on Schauffele here for that. I wanted to ask as well, for somebody that maybe was doing a little bit more research and found something that, you didn't think that the odds were taking into account, or that the field was overlooking, or something like that. Do you guys have any thoughts on like a general heuristic about how you would make an adjustment to that projection? Will, one thing you had mentioned when we talked MMA last year is to just basically be cautious with making like significant projection changes because of the way that affects the sims, where that fighter in that case is having like a very high upside outcome. Basically, you can like be all of a sudden pulling from sims that are impossible. Like, do you guys have any like general heuristics or rules of thumb about like how much would be too much for somebody to give somebody just a bump, maybe even that they wanted to get a little bit more of?
Yeah, I think Eric touched on it when he was talking about like if it's a stroke difference, like if you're expecting them to be, say, 1 stroke better than we are, then what works out to like 2 points, I think is what you said. Like, it's not, we're not going to be 15, 20 points off on their average score. So I think really keeping it small and around 2 to 3 points is probably correct, unless you really disagree with us. If like you think Tiger is going to win and you want to be all in on that, bump him more. But like, if you're just assuming that most things in Vegas are efficient, etc., but you want to be a little bit higher on someone, then like 2 to 3 points is what I think.
Perfect.
Yeah, I agree. I think, around sort of what like a birdie is worth in whatever like whatever scoring you're using. So if it's full, it's like 3 points maybe. Like I think anywhere in that sort of range is probably appropriate. But I think, I mean, it depends how you want your lineups, really. So, but again, I think I'll echo Will's point and say just to be cautious with it.
And one other thing here too. So when you pull up the default sliders here for most contests, basically everything is pretty high sim diversity, like 9 or 10, using like very close to single tournament sims or very small buckets of sims, and also pretty aggressive with the ownership fade slider. I mean, a 3 or 4, like I would say relatively aggressive compared to something like NBA. I know we haven't like done a full re-slider back test here for this new sim, but what are your guys' thoughts on the sliders in general? I mean, does this kind of feel in line with what you think strategically makes sense? High variance, high diversity, and like a relative aggression with ownership? Or I'm just kind of curious your guys' thoughts there.
At least personally, I definitely the way that I've been building, at least for tomorrow's tournament, is running 0 ownership fade, but max smart diversity, and then handling ownership of lineups like through rules or filters on like the second step, like once we're looking at the lineups. I think at least the way that I'm approaching it right now, I haven't obviously got to look at a ton of contests with our new sim and how that all looks, but I'm assuming ownership is going to be reasonably efficient for like full slates, like for the full like 4-day slates. And so if ownership is going to be pretty efficient, then I mostly just want to optimize my ownership to be around the contest size so that I'm not, I'm letting other people make construction mistakes and letting my construction sort of give me the EV that there is.
What would those construction mistakes look like? What mistake would somebody make?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is if people are playing too many low probability golfers, like if they're, say, maybe too aggressive on ownership fade, or on the other end, if they're playing too chalky, if they're getting duped and things like that. I think it's trying to find the middle ground of like really almost finding the highest ownership lineups that aren't duped. Is if you're assuming that ownership's efficient, that's what you should be looking to do. Gotcha.
Yeah, I think that's kind of in line with what I'm thinking here as well. One of the angles that I was kind of coming at this from is, on NFL Showdown, a lot of times I've told people, once if you're playing with sim diversity at 10, it almost makes sense to just turn ownership fade off and handle that post build like you were talking about, to make sure that you're not like disrupting. When you have sim diversity at 10, it's kind of a very unique state where you're getting that single event optimal. But once you introduce ownership fade, you might not be, because of the way that calculation is taking place. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I am kind of curious. You mentioned like controlling ownership yourself post build. What does that look like for you? Like, what are some things that you're looking for? I mean, are you kind of envisioning like a max ownership ceiling that you just want to make sure you're not playing above and beyond? Or is it something that you're, I don't know, incorporating elsewhere? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So what I did was just set up let me see what I can do exactly, but it was sort of taking the product of the ownership. So if you multiply all 6 ownerships in your lineup, and then doing 1 divided by that number, trying to get that to be close to what the like field size is. So let me see if I can pull up what my rules were.
No, that makes sense. So basically, like, the idea is I've talked about the geometric mean rule in office hours videos before, but basically trying to set up a rule for that to make sure that you're like playing a lineup with an expectation of being played about once. Is that the idea?
So I just checked. I have it as my geo mean to be between 16 and 22% for the geo mean of ownership, and then doing 0, 0, 10 within that. So basically, give me what SaberSim thinks the best lineups are that are within this bound of like, I guess you'd call it leverage, like how frequent it's going to be the optimal.
Interesting. Okay.
I think too, like this, the current slate is pretty unique, and really we won't see these like this small of a field until I think really like the end of the year. And so like I think that it seems to me though that like this week you kind of want to treat it more like NFL Showdown. And then once we get into the big weeks where there's 160 golfers in the field, obviously you want to incorporate ownership, but it's just easier to kind of get to a non-duped build or, something like that, which I think is important to keep in mind just because we are starting with kind of a weird event.
Right. Yeah. And it's one, I think, is one where avoiding duplication is actually going to be particularly important. I mean, golf is kind of one of those sports in general where I think it's right on the edge of where like there will be lineups that are massively duped in any given contest. A lot of times they're optimals for different given projection systems. But this event, a smaller field, no cut, I think it's especially more likely that like duplication could be really affecting the EV of lineups. So something to look out for there. One question that we had gotten from people as well, in general, if you could give one thing that actually would be helpful to look into if somebody wanted to do a little bit more additional research, what would that be based on like, how we've set this up here?
Yeah, so I can start with this one. And this is kind of how we're currently taking our round score and turning it into DK points. Essentially, what we are assuming there is that there isn't any variance in like how players are going to score. So, I think that the best way to kind of explain it is an example. And so sort of the prototypical, just like only pars guy used to be Jim Furyk, where there were so many times where he would go through a tournament and he would make 18 pars. And that was just, that was the way he played. He was conservative, get it on the green, 2-putt. Versus the other end of the spectrum is maybe someone like Tony Finau, who is going to take more chances on par fives. And the DK point scoring really favors the guys like now who are going to make both birdies and bogeys. Like all else equal, you'd rather have your golfer make 9 birdies and 9 bogeys versus just 18 pars. But so currently in the sim, whether it was Jim Furyk or Tony Finau, we would be, giving them the same probability of having like same type of round, I guess. And so I think like if you find stuff like that where someone is just like a super high variance player within their whole results, you can add some value there where, this player is going to eagle a lot more, but also double bogey. I think that's a spot where you can improve a little bit. But again, I think you can make mistakes there just from like, if you're looking at like box scores and someone is playing a really easy course all the time, like you sort of can infer the wrong way, I guess. So I just, I think that that's a way to add value, but it's not as simple as just like looking at, who's birdieing the most, because that has a lot to do with other factors rather than just the player's play style.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It kind of like leads in here well to this question: does SaberSim factor in birdie streak bonus probability or eagle probability? If I'm understanding you correctly, basically we would assume that golfers of the similar skill level in our ladder projected or in a given sim scoring the same amount of points in a given round have the same probabilities of these events, basically.
Yeah. So we are factoring like those in. So essentially when, if say we choose a player is -2 for this round, we're kind of going to look through all of the historic ways that players got to -2. So was it 2 birdies and 16 pars? Was it 3 birdies, 1 bogey, and then 15 pars? Like, we are pulling from that, and we're pulling, I guess, from like the historical chance of each of those happening. But again, there's no differentiation between like, oh, golfer A, might have a higher chance of this type of round versus golfer B.
Gotcha.
And I do think that, just to add in real quick, that in the hole by hole sim, we will capture that, as well as what Eric touched on in the last one, which is like the different aggressiveness levels of each player. So when we make the switch to hole by hole in the coming few weeks, that all will be sort of captured naturally.
So we'll almost pick up on, like you said, like golfer aggressiveness, like almost like tendencies of the way that a golfer tends to play.
Right. So I haven't looked at like specific golfers, but if Furyk has a much lower eagle rate and a much higher par rate, that's going to be factored into how we ultimately predict him for any given tournament. So like those, how aggressive they are, like, does get reflected in how often they eagle or how often they double bogey, which then does get reflected in how we are predicting them to in the future eagle, par, double bogey.
Will that take into account like context? Like potentially a golfer that is like chasing first in round 4 in a given sim, like may play more aggressively to get there?
I would really like it to. I don't think initially that it will.
I imagine that'd be hard to quantify, but I feel like
Yeah.
that's kind of an interesting.
That is very interesting. And I think that might be something good to add on like round 4 showdown projections.
Yeah.
That might be a good place to tinker. It's like, if we're not considering that, but the person in third, needs to gain 5 strokes or something like that, they certainly are going to have more eagles, birdies, and bogeys and double bogeys than we might otherwise be predicting them for.
Yeah, it's an interesting one there.
Assuming that they're playing to win.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not. I mean, that's the other thing. Yeah, like maybe they're FedEx ranking or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, even like going, like, say you're in third place and your choice is to play aggressive and maybe get first, but that's also going to shoot you possibly down to like 7th. The way that golfers are paid out is like it's based on your finishing position. So, I think definitely like there's a potential that if someone is in third, they're not just going to go like, oh, let me, pull out the driver on this par 4 and potentially hit in the water. Like, I do think that there's the motivation there is a little bit split, where obviously they want to get first, but a third place payout is a lot more than 7th. So
I know we are getting pretty close on time here. And I know I just asked kind of a similar question about like researching and making adjustments to projections. But to wrap us up, I'll kind of ask both of you guys, maybe one thing that you'd recommend somebody looks into. And Eric, I guess if you've already said yours, that's fine too. But one thing you'd recommend somebody looks into if they're maybe just starting golf for the first time, want a little bit of a sweat this week, and wants to leave a little bit of an impact on their builds. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that like that the variance of player, I think is probably my number one.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just go with that. I'm curious what Will thinks on this.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, mine is perhaps a little too nerdy in saying that it would be an ownership type thing. I'd probably just like fade whoever won the last couple of years. Like if I'm not doing anything else and I want a sweat, I'd probably fade whoever looks like they're going to be overly chalky because of course history or something, and just dropping them down a few points and then running.
And I'll throw mine in as well. I think in golf in particular, it seems like people get very attached to a really tight pool of players based on some kind of perceived thing, whether it's like strokes gain data or course history or like whatever that thing is that week. And it makes the, like, what I think is one of the highest variance DFS sports way even higher variance. I would recommend using a high sim diversity slider at the very least, but also avoiding making too restrictive of a pool. I am definitely not the type to, go into a golf event with 20, 25 golfers. Like I will probably have exposure to the majority of golfers in this pool in 150 because I think that the ranges of outcomes are pretty wide. There's a wide variety of lineups that are profitable for something like this. So,
yeah. And I'll also add to that, like, the showdowns help with that too, right? You essentially have 4 tournaments in a week instead of just the one, which just can kind of help to smooth that variance just a little bit.
Cool. So a couple final thoughts here. First of all, if you are listening to this here or joining us for the first time, I see we have a couple first-time people in our chat, which is great. We do offer a totally free 7-day trial on our site, SaberSim.com. You can come get signed up right now, get a free 7 days, check us out with our new golf sims for this tournament, but also get access to NBA through the end of the week into next week, the last week of NFL. We've got obviously spring slowly kind of starting to approach here as well. We have, baseball, obviously, NASCAR, other sports here for the warmer seasons. So definitely check us out if you haven't already. For the folks that are already in the community, I'm planning on having some more golf content here coming out for the next couple of weeks. I want to get a video out that kind of provides just some general strategy, some general advice to tackle golf DFS, but I think also would love to hop on Andrew's office hours here sometime in the next week just to answer more general kind of strategy, SaberSim process type questions. I know there were a ton of those that came in leading up to this show that we didn't get into there as well. So hopefully more golf content coming. But in the meantime, Will, Eric, really appreciate all the hard work you guys put into this. I'm super excited to check this out. And of course, a big thank you for coming on to the show and talking to me here about it today. But otherwise, in the meantime, I guess we will call it there.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks.
See you, everybody.